Welcome to A Game of Ice and Fire, a video series devoted to a Song of Ice and Fire wargame by Cool Mini or Not. We cover all aspects of the hobby with tactics and list build videos, painting tutorials of varying levels, and battle reports. In this video, we're going to be going over some list build theory with Brynden Tully the Blackfish, and as a small reminder, this is Brynden Tully on foot, not the one that's mounted. In order to understand where we need to start building the Blackfish list, we need to look at his tactics cards that he brings first. The first one that we come across is Tully Valor. When this unit is attacked with a melee attack after the attack dice are rolled, the unit then gets +1 to its defense save rolls for that attack, and if it's a House Tully unit, they automatically pass their panic test as well for the attack. So right now we're seeing a little bit more of a survivable element to this card. We're getting the +1 defense save, but we do get to check to see what the dice look like afterwards to see if it's even worth using this card to get the most out of it. And if we are a House Tully unit, we get to pass the panic test as well. So it's really about digging in there and staying alive with this card. The next one is Refuse to Yield. This triggers when a friendly unit passes a morale test. That unit may restore 2 wounds, and if they're a House Tully unit, they restore D3 +1 wounds instead. Again, we're getting more of this survivable element going on. Now, the House Stark units are pretty good in terms of morale stats, so this should be able to trigger fairly regularly, and the only thing I don't like about it is the whole D3 +1 wounds instead of 2, because you still got a 33% chance that you're going to do the same with the card, even if you're doing what it wants you to by targeting a Tully unit. But I think that's just me nitpicking. It's always been, whenever I see this in the game, I just get a little ruffled by it, but by no means is it bad. It's still pretty good to just get 2 wounds back to a unit. The third card for the Blackfish is Set for Charge. When a friendly unengaged unit is charged from the front, that unit may make 1 attack action against the enemy before their charge attack is resolved. If it's a House Tully unit, the unit that charged you becomes weakened as well. So with these 3 cards, we see that the Blackfish is bringing a huge survivable theme to his list. Being able to put a little bit of offensive spice on your defensive tactics with Set for Charge is fantastic, and being a Tully unit to get the weaken token out on them just further perpetuates this idea that Brynden Tully wants his units to survive. They're digging in and they're going to try and win the combat through attrition, which Brynden Tully's trying to tip the scales on with all of these defensive perks. Next, I want to move on to figuring out what unit we're going to put Brynden Tully in. His cards get better with having Tully units, and he has the house affiliation for Tully, so we want to stick him in a non-Tully unit in order to maximize the value of that ability. He also has the Blackfish's Resolve, so each time his unit passes a morale test, they can restore a wound. He also gives them Stalwart for +2 to morale test rolls. So when we look at the Stark units that best fit this idea of getting stuck into combat and just surviving while not floundering in the combat, the first unit that I'm looking towards is the House Umber Great Axes. They have a respectable save at 4+. They have a good morale stat at 6+, but this puts them, or putting Brynden Tully in the unit puts them at a 4+ essentially, and that's getting really hard to break, even if you're debuffing them with any abilities from, say, a Lannister player or neutral player rocking a bunch of Bolton stuff. They also have reliable melee attacks hitting on 2s and 3s. They throw a lot of dice, they force a lot of saves, and in one case they don't force saves at all because you just take the wounds, period. Their issue is that they are slow, and when they start taking damage, the drop off on their attacks. It's not severe because their second attack value is the same, but they lose a lot from the front end. They go from they lose 2 off their main attack, and that stays throughout. So being able to gain a wound back from every time you take a morale test, which you should be doing regularly if you're going to be jammed in combat with this, I think it's a great unit that really benefits from every single thing that the Blackfish is giving the Great Axes. And the cards, I don't think there's one card that they really don't appreciate that Brynden could play on them. So Brynden Tully's tactics cards have a better effect on House Tully units. So we are going to be looking towards Tully Sworn Shields for this list build, and we are going to grab 2 units of those so we can make sure that we've got something to play those cards on. This way we end up having 3 Tully units, and that should be good enough to make sure that we're getting the most out of the cards when we need to. The thing about House Tully Sworn Shields is that they really do exemplify this survivable, get stuck in there and just endure attitude. They've got a 3+ save. They've got a decent morale at 6+. They also have the shield wall order, so once per round they can pop that order to automatically block D3 hits that come into them. But their issue, and well, I guess like it's not their issue so much. They hit on a 3+ in melee, which is really reliable, but they have some not super exciting stats for dice. They go from 7 to 6 to 4, which is decent, but I really want to put out more combat power while I have these guys jammed in, or else it's going to take a long time to get them unjammed, and I don't want to get to a point where my opponent just starts locking me up and just saying, okay, well, I'm just going to sit here and bounce off your Tully Sworn Shields, but they're not going to do much to me because you don't have any real combat tricks with them. So the Tully Sworn Shields are going to be really open to attachments, and I'm going for broke on these ones a bit here. So on one Tully Sworn Shield unit, we're going to put Great John Umber, the Fierce Bannerman, and he brings 2 things that end up multiplying the combat prowess of the Tully Sworn Shields. The first one would be his Onslaught ability, where if they're targeted by the combat ability on the tactics board instead of just attacking, they can make a charge instead, which it's good when they're unjammed if it's something that you have the opportunity to use. And with the Stark base deck, we're going to be going for that combat zone anyways, so just being able to get more activity out of the Sworn Shields is going to be really beneficial for us, especially when our opponent doesn't expect much out of them because they are really slow. But having this ability on them can really catch someone off guard if they're not aware it's something that you have access to. Umber also brings the Order Fury of House Umber. You can use that when the unit's attack, or when the unit makes a melee attack after the attack dice are rolled, so you get to see if you hit well enough first. That unit may then re-roll any dice if you need to, so I guess you can see if it's really bad if you can get a lot of use out of the re-rolls. Hits from rolls of 6 don't allow defense saves, but the unit does suffer D3 wounds after the attack is completed. Now we don't mind that so much because Brynden Tully's got some cards that'll buff up our troops when they start dying. There's at least one card in the Stark Tactics deck that's going to help us out, and we can also start looking towards our NCUs to help get the numbers back up if we're being ground down a little bit faster than what we'd like. The list does have this general theme of trying to endure, and I know that taking wounds doesn't seem to forward that idea, but to get the combat efficacy upped in the unit, I don't think it's so bad to take those wounds, especially if you're holding on to those cards that can get you out of some low numbers. In the other unit, we're not skipping any expenses on this one as well and putting Robb Stark in it. For enhanced mobility, we can pivot before marching, which is cool, but not super necessary. But taking the Tully Sworn Shields from speed 4 to speed 5 is really good. I think I've said before, but I believe that the tipping point for good speed and bad speed is right at 4 to 5. So 5 makes me more comfortable with a lot of the charges I can make, and being able to get up the table faster is a good it's good to be at that 5 speed instead of only only marching your 8 inches. Robb Stark also brings another ability that's very similar to what Great John Umber brings with Rapid Assault. So this is the ability that's on the Stark Outriders, and if they're targeted by the Maneuver Tactics board ability, they can charge instead of just maneuvering. So we have some surprising combat output from both of these units with being able to charge, not out of nowhere, but outside of their activation they can get a charge. So we're really polishing the combat prowess of the Tully Sworn Shields. And these are really expensive unit attachments, but I think that getting the Tully Sworn Shields to a more scary presence is going to really help us play the game out a lot better, instead of just dirtling with our attacks in combat while we're blocking hits all day but not really doing anything with them. With Robb Stark comes Grey Wind, so you have another maneuverable piece for a rather slow-moving army that can get into positions to start taking objectives, and it doesn't go without saying that Grey Wind can apply vulnerable if it's really necessary or if the opportunity opens up. So with some of the points we have left for the main build of the list, I've ended up slapping a unit of Stark Sworn Swords with a Sworn Sword Captain on them. This just gives me something to kind of position where I might need it. So the Tully Sworn Shields are probably going to be taking up middle positions on the table so that they can get into the brunt of, or wherever the scenario dictates they need to be in order to be where the action is. I don't want all those points just kind of sitting on a flank doing nothing, but the Stark Sworn Swords are good for that. They're only 6 points with the unit attachment, and they get a lot of work done with Stark Fury. They get a lot of work out of being able to apply vulnerable through martial training. The unit's just solid. I think that you can get a lot of surprising things to happen out of the Stark Sworn Swords that people don't see coming. I think they're a really undervalued unit in the Stark arsenal. So to move on to the NCUs, we at least want 2 with this list, but I don't think 3 is quite the direction to go. And we have to, in order to make points work out, we have to take Sansa Stark, which isn't terrible because the Stark tactics deck is full of amazing answers to problems you're going to encounter throughout the game. So having her isn't really it's not an unfortunate position we get put in because we can't take a 4-point NCU instead. But the 4-point slot for the NCU is really flexible. So on one hand, you can put Eddard Stark in there because you'll be able to utilize the healing ability on him, so you're just multiplying the survivability of the army, but that's a finite resource with him. He doesn't get to restock those order tokens at all, so you get 3 shots with it and you're done with him after that. So I don't know if he's quite the way to go yet. We also have access to Catelyn Stark in that 4-point slot, and removing condition tokens is a nice benefit for the list. The Sworn Shields don't particularly like being made vulnerable. It just takes away another element of their survivability. The Great Axes don't have the most amazing save, so vulnerable on them is not something they wish to have either. Mostly, even though we're throwing a really good armor save with the Sworn Shields, it's just not... it's the easiest way to start breaking down the army, and I think that she's definitely in my... She's fighting for me with the top slot for the 4-point NCU right now, but I wouldn't judge anyone for throwing her in because getting the max attack stats is nice too. It kind of it almost seems like you're getting a one turn healing effect out of them. They're not surviving, but their combat prowess or their combat output is still being held up with that ability to use your max attack stat. The one that I've opted for in this list, at least for right now, is Roderick Cassell. He has the martial expertise ability. If you've claimed the combat zone, which we want to do with this list, one enemy combat unit can become vulnerable. Then we also get to influence a unit with him, and that influencing unit gets critical blow. So I was saying that the Tully Sworn Shields are more geared towards survivability and don't have any interesting combat points to them other than a decent attack stat for the dice, and 3+ to hit is good. It's just it's a good number for them. But Roderick is going to allow us to get a lot of extra combat mileage out of them, so we get the vulnerable where we want it, we get critical blow, and there's a couple cards in the tactics deck for Starks that will help give us some cool buffs to our melee output. But I think Roderick is definitely the one to use right now, especially if you're trying to dislodge yourself, because I do want to survive, but I'm not only trying to just dig in there and keep people where they're at. I want to get into engagements, and maybe I might take the first engagement, but after that I want to start carving through things pretty quickly, and Roderick really pushes that idea forward with the list. Now, I could see maybe taking one of the really expensive unit attachments and downgrading them into maybe Brienne of Tarth when she gets a release, because I still focus on the competitive aspect of this game, so I will only ever play, or well, not play, because I've played with the Mountain before, but I will always try to build these lists with the releases in mind. So Brienne is one that could make it into the list after she gets released. She's got a neat ability. She gives a good morale stat, and we want to pass morale tests, so having Stalwart everywhere makes sense. Braun isn't someone I would particularly consider, because we're not going to be taking that wealth zone a lot, unless we're starting to gear our play more towards restoring wounds in the mid-game. But his efficacy is really contingent on having that position, and as soon as we start taking that, the phenomenal quality of the Stark Tactics deck starts to fall off a little bit. So I don't want to put myself into a position where I'm bringing a 2-point attachment that really conveys to my opponent, please take this tactics slot so you can make this unit that I paid points for less effective. Other than that, you could even go as far as to say putting a sword captain in the units just to throw vulnerable out there. And the reason why I'm saying you can downgrade these is that way you can get another 4-point NCU in the list. And Sansa Stark is always going to be awesome no matter what. She will always get you something you need right when you need it. But having Catelyn and Roderick together, I think that might be a good place to settle in. But I want to try and see how having the Great John Umber and Robb together would help the Sworn Shields get to where they need to get to. Especially since Umber really helps them get out of combat once they're in. So definitely a little bit of testing is in order for this to kind of flush out the idea of how the attachments should be set up and how the NCUs should be settled. But I think there's definitely some legitimacy to having Roderick in this list right now. I really wanted to wait to put this list together after the Tully Cavaliers had come out. From what I've seen from their artwork, it looks like they have lances, so they're going to more likely than not have the same rule that the Casterly Rock Knights have, where they get Sundering and +3 attack dice when they charge. So when those come out, we'll be able to mess with the points a little bit more, and we might just have to remove Great John Umber and the Stark Sworn Swords so that we can fit a unit of Tully Cavaliers in here, because then we just get a self-contained unit of death that runs around and starts sundering everything with a bunch of attack dice. But that's some not so rampant speculation, but it's like, I think, somewhat calculated speculation, because I can't imagine the artwork is going to change much from what's already been presented. So I look forward to seeing those come out. But with Fire and Blood being a scenario we have to plan for now, I was trying to get the jump on that with this list and make one that just survives a lot. And whether your plan is to smack me with panic tests or try and shave through my armor, bringing those 3+ saves and that high morale value or low morale value is going to make sure that I can stick out a lot of the Fire and Blood opponents that I'll be meeting. So Tully Cavaliers are going to help me a lot when they come out. Regardless, they'll probably be faster, they will have good attacks, and just give the list another Tully unit, which is something that I really want. But this list also does well on a couple other scenarios, so let's just flash a few of those up on screen and see how they stack up. So just going through from front to back on the game modes document, a Game of Thrones for this list might prove to be a little bit on the difficult side. Oftentimes, the objectives that get put out aren't necessarily ones that you'll want, or at least the ones that are accessible to you are not ones that are really great, and your opponent having a really good ability like shutting off an NCU or an attachment is going to really be a bummer time, since your list is going to take a little bit longer to get to that objective to try and take it off, and you don't have a ton of explosive combat ability out of this list other than the great axes, which again are going to take a while to get to where they want to go. So unless you can practice this scenario out and really get used to the placement of the objectives, or not used to them, but you kind of have to do it in a way that balances it out. It's just a really funky scenario that could go either way just due to the nature of the randomness of it. So if I were in a 2-list setting, I would not want to drop this into Game of Thrones if I were trying to build my pairing from a scenario perspective. Next up, Clash of Kings kind of has the same issue in that you're always going to be throwing new units on, and with not having a ton of speed, I don't know if this list can keep up with it, but the objectives are static and they're equally spread out, so you might have an easier time with this scenario. I have not played Clash of Kings yet. It's just a really strange scenario that I'll need to experience soon, and maybe this list might be the first one I try into it just to see if it can keep up with the way the scenario is paced. Feast of Crows, this is going to be an amazing army for that. Your morale checks are going to be gangbusters even if you start getting multiple reductions from these corpse piles. In terms of victory points, I think you're going to pass yours more than your opponent's going to. So I think that if you're looking at trying to snipe out a Feast of Crows pair, or a part of a Feast of Crows in your pairing, this is probably a list that you could look to answer that scenario. Winds of Winter. Winds of Winter is strange. The tactics deck for Stark, the base tactics deck, really lets you get some maneuverability going on to where you can put things where you need them, and that works really nicely when you've got something like cavalry. So I think with Game of Thrones and Winds of Winter, when the Tully Cavaliers come out, this will be a better list for those things. But for right now, Winds of Winter is all about flexibility and being able to adapt to some of the strange things that might come out of it, and that's going to help forward your ability to win this, is just bring the most versatile and adaptive list you possibly can, and I don't think that's what this one's bringing with all of the slow units. So I would caution Winds of Winter as a scenario that you'll be trying to answer with this list. A Dance with Dragons is, I think, a good scenario for this list. You're not so hindered by the inability to move fast because it's only cutting your maneuverability in half. And you should be able to, once you grab an egg with a Tully unit, just stick it out and not die from massive charges or anything like that. It's going to take a while for your opponent to pry those eggs from you, and the Stark Tactics deck does get you up further, so I don't think you have to worry about the speed being a problem with this list, especially since you only start 12 inches away from those objectives. It should be fairly easy for you to get up there and start holding them early. And then Fire and Blood, as I had mentioned earlier, this list is really tailored to this scenario, so I don't think you have any issues dropping this like into Fire and Blood. If you're looking for a specific list for Fire and Blood, I think this list does it, because those great axes with Brynden Tully, they want to be in the middle of things, so putting out the victory tokens on units whenever Tully activates, they're going to be in a really good position for that and can adapt around the table. Well, I guess not adapt around the table, but your opponent's going to be crushing into you to get those victory points, because they're going to need to apply a lot of pressure to remove some of these pieces, and you'll just be able to sit there and stack up all those tokens and start cutting people down left and right, especially with things like Roderick and the two other attachments we have on the Sworn Shields, really putting out a lot of work towards getting those victory points and closing out units. A Storm of Swords is also a scenario that I haven't played yet. Since it is excluded from the tournament guideline document, I don't see much value in playing this scenario for me. Also, with it having a very asymmetrical nature, it's one that I'm not extremely excited to play ever. I imagine I'll play it in the future just to say that I've done it, but I wouldn't be, based on what I understand from the scenario, I can't even say that. I really can't communicate anything on this scenario as long as it's not something that I have to worry about preparing for in a competitive in a competitive space. It's just not something that I'm going to try and work through on my own. Like I said, casual games are fine. I like playing casually, but I really build a lot of my experience in the game off of what the tournament guideline is set up to do, mostly because I really enjoy competitive play. So Storm of Swords, I really don't have much for you here. If this is something that's in your normal rotation of play, you would definitely know better how this list reacts on that scenario than I would. If you are looking for a list that endures really well, or you're trying to find something that plays better on the new scenario Fire and Blood, I think this list is definitely something for you to look into. And as the Tully Cavaliers get released, this list can definitely see some changes in it, since I think they're going to bring a really needed element to this. But I wanted to discuss this before Adepticon came around, just because it might be something that I bring there, because I have a feeling that Fire and Blood is going to be one of the scenarios that gets played. If you get a chance to play this list, post in the comments below and let me know how it did for you. And I look forward to making more tactics videos for you in the future, and I promise that I'll switch off of the Stark soon, but since I'm trying to play them in Adepticon, it's just what's revolving through my brain right now. For more random thoughts, just buzz on over to Big Top Gaming's Facebook page and give it a like. Posting stuff there quite frequently, and I look forward to trying to utilize some Facebook functionality in the future. So otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.